Okay, so the second half of, or the second part of this unit, of Unit 5, Part 2, is language and how language influences how we think. So I'm going to try to do this as quickly as possible, try to keep it around 15 minutes or so. So language is any sort of spoken, written, or gestured way of communicating meaning. Some interesting facts regarding language. As of 2021, there are around 7,000 known languages in the world, and 6% of the world's languages are spoken by 94% of the world's population, which means that 94% of the languages that we know of are only spoken by 6% of the world's population. Um, India itself has 122 separate languages. Each state basically has its own language. And in terms of bilingualism, um, America is relatively far behind the rest of the world. About 20% of America is multilingual, whereas around 43% of the rest of the world is multilingual. That's a little bit skewed though, because the rest of the world is multilingual because most of the rest of the world also speaks English. So we're just going to go over the basic parts of language, and then I'm going to, in person, go over the last little bit about how language influences thought. All right, so parts of language. The smallest distinctive unit of sound in a language is called a phoneme. Right? Phoneme is different than a syllable. And it is, so for instance, the word chug, the CH, that sound is considered a phoneme, the sound, the and the g. Okay. English has around 40, has around 44 different phonemes. I think that's what I wrote. I think I wrote down 44 rather than 244. Yeah, I believe English has around 44 different phonemes. Each language has its own set of phonemes, such as the rolling of the R in Spanish, right, is a phoneme. The guttural sound that you make in German is a phoneme. Um, and what's interesting with phonemes is as we develop, when we are born, our brain is set up to be able to pronounce any phoneme. We are not born with an English speaking brain or a Chinese speaking brain or anything like that. We can pronounce any different phoneme, but as we learn our household language, we lose the ability to pronounce phonemes that are not spoken in the household language. That's why when you're learning Spanish, it's hard to learn how to roll your R's. People with Chinese, Japanese, it can be hard for them to learn how to say the L sound in English because that is not a phoneme in those languages. Okay, so phonemes, smallest distinctive unit of sound in a word. This video on here. You can watch that on your own, or we'll watch it as a group. It's about interesting phonemes. Morphemes. Morphemes are the smallest unit of a word that carries a meaning. Okay, so such as prefix, suffix, the root word, okay, anything like that. How we break down a word into the separate parts that have meaning. Phonemes are put together to form morphemes, and morphemes are put together to form words. For instance, the word teacher. Think about it for a sec, figure out how many morphemes are in the word teacher. All right, hopefully you have written down that there are two. The word teach, which is the verb, okay, and then er is to do, okay, so that makes it a noun. Okay, so the word teacher has two morphemes in it, and there are two parts of the word that have meaning. So when we put all of that together, we get grammar. Grammar is the set of rules in a language that allows for us to communicate and understand each other. And there are two parts to grammar. Semantics. Semantics is how we get meaning from sound, how we get meaning from like the structure of a sentence, our lexicon, which is our vocabulary. All of these things come together to give meaning. Okay, to be allow us to do like a practical interpretation, such as so like if I say she tossed the ball, okay, the combination of those words and the order that they're in and whatnot gives you that is a sentence that makes sense. But if I said the ball tossed her, that's basically the same words, but they're in a different order. And the ordering of those words does not make any sense. The ball tossed her, that sentence is meaningless. It could also be something as little as, if somebody goes like, right? We know what that means. We know that that's kind of a judgmental sound. So semantics is just how we get meaning from language. And then syntax is just how we order the words into sentences for them to make sense. The subject verb agreement, whatnot. So, like in English, you put the adjective before the noun, White House. In Spanish, you put the noun before the adjective, Casablanca. Okay, so that is syntax. All right, so theories of language acquisition. How do we learn language? The big question with this has always been, all right, is language, is it nature or is it nurture? Is it biological or is it something from the environment? So there are two separate theories about this. All right, Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky, very, very famous psychologist, anthropologist, all these different things. Right? Chomsky has a theory of what is called inborn universal grammar. Right? This is what is called a nativist theory, meaning that essentially that language is native to humans. Okay? Language is not necessarily learned, okay, meaning learning in like the behavioral sense of learn through reinforcement or punishment. What Chomsky's theory says is that we learn language too fast for it to be through like reinforcement. Instead, his theory is that we learn language naturally and training does not really matter. So this is a nature theory. He says that we are naturally predisposed, our brain is naturally predisposed to learn grammar rules, not even with our specific language, but just with any language. And he said that in our brain, we have what he refers to as the language acquisition device. Essentially, that our brain is just set up for this. We talked about last unit how they think that the reason why chimpanzees have a better working memory than humans is because at some point our brain evolved to specifically be able to learn language where chimpanzees did not. Our brain is set up, we are naturally predisposed to be able to learn any language. All right, we might watch that later. So Chomsky is nature, right? Nurture theories. Nurture theories have been put out by a lot of different psychologists, a couple that you can probably guess. One of the main ones being B.F. Skinner, and then also Albert Bandura. Where these nurture theories essentially say that language falls into social learning. That essentially imitation facilitates language acquisition. Um, that we maybe see somebody, hear somebody say something, you see your dad ask for a cookie and your dad gets a cookie, and so then you learn, oh, well, if I say the word cookie and then please, I will then get a cookie, right? And so you learn how to you learn language that way. Um, this theory it shows that in certain languages you learn different parts of language first. For instance, in English, American children who speak English generally learn nouns first, where they found that Korean children actually generally learn verbs first. And so it goes with the categorization thing that we have talked about. But so both of these theories, language, what they have determined is that it's both. As with everything, most of our, going back to Chomsky, most of our early language is probably nature, right? When we start to learn language, it kind of just comes around 1 year of age. All of a sudden, we just start to be able to learn language. And then by age 2, it is full on. Most of that is probably nature. But then as we start to learn the specifics of our household language, that is more nurture. So, combo of the two. All right, so language development. We By the time you're fully grown, you learn about 60,000 words or so. After age 2, you start to learn about 3,500 new words per year, or about 10 per day. All right, and then it kind of levels off. So before we can actually speak, we do have what's called receptive language. This develops around 2 months or so, where even before we can talk, we can understand. Okay, children can understand what their parents are saying to them. So that is, we can receive language, but we can't necessarily produce it yet. Productive language starts at about 3 to 4 months, and productive language goes through 3 separate stages. There's the babbling stage. This is exactly what it sounds like, where there's no meaning. It's called pre-linguistic. And also, children will babble and use phonemes that are not in their native language. So they'll babble using you can't tell what language a baby's household language is just by their babbling, because they just use any phonemes, because your brain is predisposed to be able to learn any phonemes. Around the age of 1, these are easy to remember, because just remember, at 1, we go into the one word stage. From about 1 to 2 years old, we can use one word to communicate big meanings. So, it's just saying, truck, dog, food, water, whatever. Okay. They can just use one word to communicate big meanings. And then around the age of 2 is where we will go into what is called the 2-word stage, which is where they start to be able to communicate using usually nouns and verbs. This is referred to as telegraphic speech, because back in the time when we had to use telegrams, you had to pay per word. And so they would take out any unnecessary words like and, but, anything like that, and it would just be nouns and verbs. Okay, so 2-word stage is also referred to as that type of speech is called telegraphic speech. After age 2, about 25, 26 months, language develops unbelievably fast. Okay, after age 2, they are speaking in full sentences within a couple of months usually. So that is the process of language development. And all right, so what do we know also about language development is that language falls into what are called with the sensitive period, a critical or a sensitive period. Essentially, if you don't use it, you lose it. What they know is that if you don't start learning language by about the age of 7, you lose the ability to master any language. That's what we saw with Jeannie. They've also found that poverty at a young age can really inhibit language acquisition. But interestingly, if children who don't start learning language until about age 2 or 3 will be able to learn it perfectly fine. And once they do start learning it, they're not exposed to language until age 3. There will be an explosion of language, and they will go through all of the stages really, really, really quickly, right? And will basically just catch up. But after age 7, it's really hard. Also, with second languages, the older that you are, the harder it is to learn. That's why it's so stupid that they have you all start learning a second language in high school. They should just have you start doing it in kindergarten. In terms of deafness, 90% of deaf children are born to hearing parents, and so a lot of times they are not exposed to American Sign Language at an early age, which makes it a lot harder to learn American Sign Language if once you get older. So, um, and a lot of times they may not be exposed to language at all in early years if they are deaf and the parents cannot sign, which can hinder language development as well. And then, just as a quick little review, language and brain. So we talked about this before. Areas of the brain that's involved in language. Wernicke's area back in the left temporal lobe, where we do language comprehension and making language meaningful. Brain development actually shows us a lot about language development. So Wernicke's area, the neurons are myelinated by around 6 months or so, meaning they are fully communicating, which is why we can start understanding language at an earlier than we can actually start speaking in language, because Wernicke's area is language comprehension. Broca's area, left frontal lobe, right there. Muscles involved in the physical production of speech. As you remember, it's connected to the motor cortex. These begin to myelinate at around 12 months, which corresponds with your ability to start actually going into the one-word stage. And then by 2 years, everything is fully myelinated. This is why language develops so rapidly after 2 years. And then, just as a reminder, aphasia is any sort of impairment of language abilities. All right, so I'm going to cut it off right there, and we are going to go over Whorf's linguistic relativity as a group because it's really interesting. It's also a little bit more confusing. So, there you go.